Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a new brewer to me. Today's beer comes from North Park Beer Company out of San Diego, California. And this one is called Birdie to Bogey. It's a Pilsner. On the can, it specifically says California Pils. Clocks in at 5.4% ABV. And this is one that we're going to talk about before we get into this beer. But first, let's go ahead and check out the label art. I am not sure what the significance of what I'm looking at is on the label here. Birdie to Bogey, you would almost assume a golf reference, but I don't even know what that is. I'm looking at chains hanging from some contraption on a pole. I have no earthly clue. But nonetheless, that's what's on the label art. Nice bright blue color. So, California Pils. This, I do not believe, is a recognized sub-style of Pilsner. I mean, it seems like every other day there's the flavor of the week, somebody wanting to name their own thing, and totally cool, fine. I get it. I'm okay with that. But what exactly is a California Pils? I mean, I would just be guessing here. If it's anything like typical regional kind of Bens, I think that we can point to the hop bill that we know that they used in this beer to maybe give us an idea here. Much like California has their sub-style of West Coast style IPAs known for being very hoppy, very bitter forward, very bitter dominant, use typically a lot of the very resinous and pine, the dank hops in their sub-style. I'm guessing that that might be what they're doing with the Pilsner beer style, calling it California Pils, because they used a combination of 3 hops in this: Strata, Citra, and Mosaic. All 3 of which are high alpha acid content, new hop varieties that would absolutely be perfectly at home in any West Coast style IPA, only they're here in a Pilsner beer base style. So I'm expecting that this may be much more akin to like a German, probably even more so, but more like a German Pilsner that's going to have a bit more bitter forward bite to it. But we'll see when we jump in there. 5.4, that's slightly higher than your average Pilsner ABV, but it's certainly right in range. So let's just go ahead and get this one cracked, and we're going to get it poured right in our old Pilsner glass. Gently there. All right, that one is starting to foam up just a tick, having opened it. So we're going to be relatively gentle here on the initial pour. I'm going to try to get the bulk of the volume in there first before I go crazy down the middle, because it is a Pilsner. It's going to form a big thick head, and we want to leave space for that to do its thing. Voila. I think that's one of the better pours I've done to date. Already getting huge aromas off of this beer, a foot and a half away from it. Smells fantastic. Visually, that is a classic Pilsner color, that very light, pale straw yellow. I mean, just classic visually. In terms of carbonation, this one is quite active. I'm not sure if you can see it on camera, but it's got very, very classic, fast-moving carbonation out of the bottom of this glass. It is kind of a combination of all different sizes of carbonation rushing up. I see super fine champagne-like carbonation coming up slower than the larger ones. There's some medium, larger. So it's got a good mix. And of course, it formed that nice classic Pilsner head on top. Let's get right up over this for a full sniff. Oh, wow, yeah. Okay, so this beer, the aroma, puts me in mind of an amalgam. It smells like an amalgam of a few different beer-style aromas. There's definitely undercurrents of a classic Pils, but there's also elements of this that smell a lot like an IPA, a lot that's putting me in mind of a New England IPA. So we've got kind of bits and pieces of different beer styles coming out of the aroma. I don't want to say it doesn't smell like a Pilsner, because it does, but it's because of the hop bill that they used. It's a very non-traditional hop blend. So in this beer style, it puts the nose in mind of different styles. Even though I know it's in a Pilsner base, everything I'm smelling on this glass is screaming at me IPA, which is not a bad thing. It smells fantastic though. The elements that I am really getting on this that put me in mind of a Pilsner, there is this slight honey sweet aroma, which you often get from the malts that are used in a Pilsner. But because of the hops that they used, I'm also definitely getting strong notes of citrus. I'm also getting strong notes of a little bit of tropical fruit, current coming through there as well, and slight suggestions of pine. Mosaic, often known, famously so, for blueberry aromas. I'm getting none of that in this glass, but there is strong lemon and orange and grapefruit and maybe even a bit of papaya on there. Touches of pineapple. It's got a definite aroma that smells of the hops that they used. So yeah, let's just jump right in and see together what this California Pils is all about. I'm expecting it's going to be very good. Head is settled down, still holding true. Let's jump in. Okay, yeah. All right. All right. I see what they're doing with this. So this one's a little bit interesting. Not exactly what I expected, but it's very, very good. So the first thing I can say is texturally, this is just perfect. It's got this really nice silky mouthfeel. When you agitate it around the palate, it feels very, very creamy. It's got the right amount of resistance for the ABV. It's not a heavy beer. It's easy, medium, light. So texture-wise and weight-wise, it feels like a Pilsner. Aroma-wise, it's got some elements that taste like a Pilsner or smell like a Pilsner. But then when you get into the flavor profile, there's not a ton, at least from the hop variety side, that puts you in mind of a Pilsner. Indeed, it puts me much more in mind of a New England style IPA, and it really is more because there's not a big bite of bitters. I expected it might actually be much more bitter forward than even a classic German Pilsner would be because of the hops that they used, but it almost feels like they took a New England IPA style approach to it where they're drawing out aroma and flavor into the base beer, but not leaving it in the boil for a very long time. Maybe they did some dry hopping, so it's not extracting out all these big alpha acids to bitter up the beer. Indeed, I would say, I think your average Czech Pilsner even has a much bigger bitter bite than this one does. But what it does bring to the table is a completely different and interesting flavor profile to the classic Pilsner style. So it's clear, texture-wise and weight-wise, that it's a Pilsner, and a lot of the subtlety of the underlying malt flavor characteristic really says Pilsner, but it's the hops in this one that take it in a completely different direction on the palate. And it really does, because of this hop blend and the noticeable lack of bitters, taste a lot more akin to, say, a New England style IPA than it does a classic Pilsner. I think it's an interesting creation. I'm not sure that the average person that was craving a traditional Pilsner would necessarily want to grab this instead of a normal Pilsner. But, you know, everybody's thoughts are completely different. That's a subjective category and take. But what I can tell you is it's very well made. It's different, and I like it. So I'm going to jump back in for a second sip here. I'm just going to top this guy off here. Yeah, may as well get the rest of it in there. And we are going to jump back in and let everything re-intensify, pick it apart again, make sure I didn't miss anything. Then we'll talk about the balance and we'll talk about the finish. First sip, very interesting beer, and I like it. Take two. Slight bitter bite up front. It's slight. Like perceptions to my palate, maybe 10 IBUs. So very subtle. But there is this nice honey sweetness you get up front with that slight bite. Then it starts to open up into the underlying malts. And that's where it really does start to taste like a Pilsner. But as it opens up further over time, you start to get these undercurrents and waves of the hop flavor characteristics, and that's where it really goes in a different direction. It's got a lot of big fruit flavor characteristic coming out of it that is very atypical for your average Pilsner, and it's because of the hop blend that they used. I am definitely getting citrus very big. That could be coming from really any of the three. I think I'm getting a lot of this underlying kind of papaya flavor coming out of the Strata, but it's nice. It's interesting. It's definitely different from your average Pilsner, so I see why they decided to use their own kind of moniker, their own sub-style on this, but it's very, very good. So what do I think this beer is? I would say at its heart, yes, it is a Pilsner, but it is definitely its own animal. So maybe this will become a recognized sub-style of Pilsner. Or if even anybody wanted to use the old catch-all American Pilsner, and then we get into further subcategories, but it's definitely its own beast. Pilsner, yes, but would you recommend this to somebody that, knows a traditional standard Pilsner, and that's what they're going for? Maybe not. This would possibly be one that somebody that doesn't drink a lot of lagers, but drinks New England IPAs, maybe try this beer. I think they would definitely enjoy it. And certainly, it still has a lot of the hallmark classic Pilsner characteristics I love. This would be tremendous on a hot summer's day. Get done cutting the lawn, come back in. I would go for this beer all day long. It's very refreshing. It's very light. It's crisp. So let's talk about the balance on this. Overall, I think the balance of what they did with it is very, very nice. Personally, especially with this hop blend, I would have subjectively liked more bitters to come through, but that's a personal preference thing. It did have a little bite up front, and then it opens up into classic Pilsner malt bill undercurrents and territories, even some that subtle honey sweetness, and then it opens up into these interesting hop flavors you don't normally find. But the balance of how they put that all together is fantastic. You get hops and you get malt bill. And it's really both kind of, they do their own thing. They're not vying for attention. You get to pick them out, and it still had some subtle bitterness. So the balance on this, I really think, is top tier. In terms of the finish, this is a beer that has definitely a longer than average finish. And it's coming down to the intensity of the hop flavors, the Strata Citra Mosaic trifecta, pushing out through this. It's not lingering bitters, but it's intensity of hop flavors. That also is leading to quite a long delay between when you swallow and you finish that sip of beer before you get to any suggestion of dryness. It really comes a minute and a half after each sip, and it's very, very subtle, and it is right on the tip of the tongue. So that's pretty typical for a Pilsner, but this one's maybe not quite as crisp and truncated and succinct of a finish as you would find on your average Pils. It is there. It just takes a while to get there. So yeah, definitely its own thing. It's definitely a unique take on a classic Pilsner. I gotta say though, I'm a big fan, and I'm hoping that I can find some more of these. I really, really like what they're doing with this. It just gives us craft beer lovers one more option out there in a marketplace, and I'm glad that Pilsners are starting to gain more attention here in the States again. I absolutely love them. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was North Park Beer Company's Birdie to Bogey, a California Pilsner clocking in at 5.4% ABV. North Park Beer Company is based in San Diego, California. So this was a really interesting beer. I really liked it. Had a lot to offer. Definitely not quite what I expected, though, never having had this new sub-style offshoot, if it's going to be its own thing, I could easily see there being an argument being made for it. But nonetheless, let's just jump right in. This was one of those beers that did exceptionally well across all categories. There were only 2 categories where I did not give it a perfect score. The first of those was the taste. And before I even ramble on here, I can tell you I was being really nitpicky because I thought this actually tasted really, really good. For me, for what they did with it, for what it was, I would have liked a little more of a classic kind of Pilsner flavor profile to come through with a bit more intensity, but since they're kind of doing their own California thing with it, and knowing the high alpha acid content hops that they use, Strata Citra Mosaic, I was kind of hoping that I would get a bit more bittering come through that, kind of akin to, say, a German-style Pilsner, but maybe amped up. That didn't happen. It was actually quite subtle. What they did with the hops almost reminded me of taking a New England IPA and hybridizing it with a Pilsner. So it was really, really nice. Just for me, for the taste, I would have liked a bit more hop presence to come through in it, especially using a hop bill like that. But nitpicky, I only docked 1 point here. The taste gets a 9 out of 10. Then the second category that did not get a perfect score was the balance. And it's absolutely interrelated what I was just discussing. So in general, I thought that the balance on the beer was well above average. For a Pilsner, sure, great. It comes down to a balance between the hops and the malts as a rule. For me, going their own direction and using these big new hop strains in there, I stand by my prior statement that I would have just liked a bit more presence to come through, not just aromatically and not just with the underlying fruit characteristics. Like if somebody wanted a non-hoppy, lighter beer, granted this is of course a lager being a Pilsner, you could just as easily grab a New England style IPA or a session New England style and keep it in the same ABV range. I think that there was maybe a slightly missed opportunity here. But I have not seen this California sub-style prior. I have not seen a ton of them. I'm going to be keeping my eyes out to see kind of where the trend with this, nomenclature goes, what they do with it. But I do absolutely applaud them for doing something different, and I really liked what they chose for the hop bill regardless. But bitters, I would have liked a bit more of a kick and a bit more of that upfront kind of underlying Pilsner malt flavor that you come to immediately know is a Pilsner when you sip on it. Again, I'm really being nitpicky here. I docked 2 points on the balance, so it does get an 8 out of 10. And that does leave a perfect 10 out of 10 in the remaining 8 categories. That is aroma, body, mouthfeel, finish, head and retention, appearance, feeling and intangible, and example of style. Which does bring the total score on North Park Beer Company's Birdie to Bogey to a 97. So yeah, I mean, this beer nearly got a perfect score. I'm really being picky here, but I thought I would at least share what I experienced with you and kind of my thoughts on it. But absolutely fantastic beer. I always like jumping into a Pilsner. It's just a fantastic beer style. Anytime somebody wants to do something new with a well-established beer style, it's always a treat. And certainly to have a beer like this as the first beer from a new-to-me brewer, it was an excellent beer drinking experience. I cannot recommend this one enough. Extremely refreshing. I absolutely loved it. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications. Hit that bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep your beer, keep your craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.